Welcome to Golden Era Stories. Tonight, Dean Martin is going to walk onto the most watched stage in America, pour himself a drink, flash that smile, and make 60 million people believe he is the happiest man alive. Summer of 1964. Everybody Loves Somebody is sitting at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The Beatles, at the absolute peak of their first American invasion, have been knocked off the top spot by Dean Martin, a 47-year-old kid from a steel town in Ohio who dropped out of school at 15, who boxed under a name nobody remembers, who once dealt cards in the back rooms of clubs that didn't officially exist, untouchable, unbothered, grinning like a man who had never once been afraid of anything. Now, cut to a different stage. Las Vegas, March 21st, 1987. Dean Martin is performing when the call comes in. His son's plane, an F-4 Phantom, California Air National Guard, has gone down somewhere into the San Bernardino Mountains. They haven't found the wreckage yet. They haven't found Dino yet. Have you ever watched someone perform happiness so convincingly that you forgot, or they forgot, that it was a performance? Leave a comment below, because that is exactly what this story is about. Steubenville, Ohio sits on the western bank of the Ohio River, right where Ohio bumps up against West Virginia. It is not a romantic place. It never was. In the first decades of the 20th century, it was a steel and coal town. Furnaces running day and night, shift work, paychecks that disappeared faster than they arrived. The air carried the smell of the mills the way other towns carry the smell of rain. You stopped noticing it after a while. That was the first thing Steubenville taught you. How to stop noticing things that weren't going to change. The men who lived there worked with their bodies until their bodies gave out. Their sons watched them do it and understood, without being told, that the world had a specific plan for people like them, and that plan did not involve a great deal of choosing. You worked the mill, or you worked the mine, or you found something in between. You came home tired. You did it again. The horizon in Steubenville was a practical thing. Not a metaphor, not a promise. Just the edge of what was visible from where you were standing. The Italian-American community in Steubenville was tight-knit in the way immigrant communities become tight-knit when the world outside is not particularly interested in making room for you. You spoke the language at home. You kept the traditions. You trusted the people who looked like you and prayed like you and remembered the same villages back across the water. There was dignity in that. There was also a ceiling, and everyone knew exactly where it was. Gaetano Crocetti had come from Montesilvano, a small coastal town on the Adriatic side of Italy, where the land meets the sea in a way that has nothing in common with the Ohio River Valley. He crossed the Atlantic, landed in Ohio, and became a barber. He married Angela Barra, and on June 7, 1917, they had a son. They named him Dino. Gaetano could not have known what the name would eventually mean to the world. Neither could Dino. Dino Paul Crocetti grew up in a household where Italian came naturally and English was something you worked at because the world outside required it. He was not a difficult child and not a remarkable one. Not obviously marked for anything in particular. He liked music. He had a voice that people noticed when he used it, which was often enough. And a face that made people want to trust him, which in a steel town is worth almost nothing but in the right rooms would turn out to be worth everything. The charm was not manufactured yet. At 10 years old, it was just a thing he had. He didn't know what it was for. He dropped out of school at 15. There is nothing to dramatize about that fact. It was not a rebellion. It was arithmetic. A boy in a steel town with a finite number of futures in front of him, and school was not making those futures more available. He worked in the mill for a time, long enough to understand what the rest of his life would look like if he kept working in the mill. He ran bootleg liquor. The money was there for people willing to operate in the spaces between the rules, and Dino had always been comfortable in those spaces. He dealt cards in backroom games where the clientele had strong reasons for not wanting their names remembered. He learned in those rooms how to read people, how to appear relaxed when you aren't, how to give nothing away while appearing to give everything. These were not skills he was taught. They were skills the rooms required, and he acquired them the way you acquire anything in a steel town, by necessity. He boxed under the name Kid Crocetti, not as a hobby but as income. He took real damage in those rings. The crooked nose was not decoration and not an accident. It was the physical record of a young man who had decided that getting hit was preferable to the alternative. He was not a great fighter. He was a willing one, which in the back rooms of Steubenville was almost the same thing. What is the earliest moment you can remember when you understood that where you come from and where you're going are two completely different things? Drop it in the comments, because Dino Crocetti understood it early. Before he had the language for it, before he knew that what he was feeling had a name. He understood that Steubenville was not a destination. It was a starting condition. And he was already, in the way that 15-year-olds sometimes are before anyone around them notices, working on the problem of how to leave it behind. He changed his name to Dean Martin sometime in his early 20s. The new name was smoother. It belonged to a different kind of person. Not a barber's son from an Ohio river town. Not a kid who answered to Kid Crocetti in rings that nobody put on record. Dean Martin. The name itself was an act of invention. And he would turn out to be extraordinarily good at invention. He met Jerry Lewis in 1945. The meeting happened in Atlantic City. Two young men trying to find their footing in the post-war entertainment world, and somehow the chemistry between them was immediate and impossible to fake. Martin was the handsome one. Lewis was the chaos. Together they were something neither of them could have been alone, which is both the best and the most unsustainable kind of partnership. What made the act work was a specific dynamic that audiences felt before they understood it. Lewis needed Martin as an anchor. Without the straight man, the chaos had nowhere to land. And Martin needed Lewis in a different way, a way he may not have fully articulated even to himself. Lewis gave Dean permission to be the one who didn't try, the one who was above the effort, the one for whom everything came easy. The persona was born in that partnership, not constructed deliberately but discovered. The way you discover something that was always there, waiting for the right conditions. Martin and Lewis became one of the largest acts in American entertainment. 16 films, sold-out venues from coast to coast, television appearances that stopped the national conversation. At their peak, they were not merely popular. They were the kind of famous that changes the temperature of a room when you walk into it. For a decade, Dino Crocetti from Steubenville was one half of the most recognizable comedy act in America. The mill, the boxing ring, the backroom card games. All of it was somewhere behind him now, so far behind that a new audience had no reason to imagine it had ever existed. And then it ended. On July 25th, 1956, playing to a sold-out crowd at the Copacabana in New York City, Martin and Lewis performed together for the last time. The split was not clean, and it was not without pain. Two men who had built something irreplaceable together, discovering that the thing they had built no longer had room for both of them. Both privately believed their careers were finished. They were both wrong. But Dean took longer to prove it, and the years between the split and the proof were quieter than anything that had come before. He made films, he worked the clubs, he kept performing. The ease was still there. The persona held even without Lewis as its counterweight. But it wasn't until the summer of 1964 that the argument was settled definitively. Everybody Loves Somebody went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the Beatles. At that particular moment, the most dominant force in popular music on either side of the Atlantic were displaced from the top spot by a 47-year-old from Steubenville who had once taken punches for money and dealt cards in rooms that didn't officially exist. Dean Martin was not supposed to be relevant in 1964. He was anyway. The Dean Martin Show launched on NBC in September 1965 and ran until 1974. 30 million, 40 million, 50 million viewers a week, depending on the season. Dean would stroll out onto the stage with a drink in his hand. Always the drink, always the ease, always the half-grin that suggested the whole enterprise was slightly beneath him in the most charming possible way. What the audience could not have known, and what would only become widely documented much later, was that the glass most nights contained apple juice. The drunk act was constructed. The ease was practiced. Dean Martin, the most effortlessly unbothered man in American entertainment, had worked with great deliberateness to appear as though he had never worked at all. The Rat Pack, the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, Ocean's 11 in 1960, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and Dean, always slightly off to one side, always fractionally more amused than everyone else in the room. By the mid-1960s, he was one of the highest-paid entertainers in America. He had built something from a steel town and a crooked nose and a name that wasn't his that looked, from almost every available angle, like a charmed life. Have you ever built something so large that the real version of you quietly disappeared inside it? Tell us in the comments. Because what Dean Martin had constructed by 1965 was airtight. The persona was complete. The distance between the performance and the man had become impossible to measure from the outside. But what the audience could not see from their seats was already beginning to take shape. The weight that doesn't appear in the frame. The cost that doesn't show up in the numbers. And what it became would change everything. The Tonight Show, NBC, Burbank, California. Late 1960s. The specific date is not what matters. What matters is the room and what it contains. Dean Martin walks out to the desk to the kind of applause that has become, by this point in his career, more like a natural phenomenon than a human response. The audience does not cheer for Dean Martin the way they cheer for other performers. They receive him like weather, like something that was always going to arrive and always going to make you feel a specific way. He sits. The drink is already there. It is always already there. He picks it up with the ease of a man who has made this gesture 10,000 times, which he has. Johnny Carson is watching him. The audience is watching him. 60 million people will watch the tape of this conversation in the days that follow. What they will see is the most convincing performance of a man at peace that American television has ever produced. The lives are real. The conversation is imagined. What Carson knows, what everyone in the room knows, is the public record. The hits, the films, the Rat Pack, the show. What nobody in the room knows, because Dean Martin has never given anyone a reason to ask, is what happens when the lights go off. The 3 children from his first marriage to Betty McDonald. The 4 children with Jan. 7 children and a man who is on the road so consistently that home has become a theoretical concept. He has built a life that looks, from the outside, like a man who needs nothing. He has been meticulous about this. He has not let the seams show. Carson asks something easy. He always asks something easy with Dean. There is a kind of agreement between them, or perhaps just a recognition that Dean Martin does not do the other kind of interview. Dean laughs. The laugh is real and performed simultaneously. He has been doing this long enough that the two are no longer separable. He says something funny. The audience responds. What almost surfaces, and what doesn't, is the question of what any of this is for. He has the #1 song. He has the television show. He has the persona that half of America has adopted as a symbol of what it looks like to move through the world without weight. And somewhere underneath it is a barber's son from Steubenville who boxed under a name nobody remembers and learned before he was 20 that the world does not make room for you. You make room for yourself, and you do it by becoming someone else entirely. Have you ever been in a room where the most important thing you were carrying never came up once? Where the conversation was easy and warm and entirely beside the point? Leave a comment below. Because that is what this night was. The most important thing in the room never came up. It almost never did. Carson laughs at something Dean says. Dean picks up the glass. The audience loves him. He lets them. The night moves forward, as nights do. The seams hold. What none of them know. Carson, the audience, the 60 million people who will watch at home, is that in the mountains east of Los Angeles, 20 years from now, an F-4 Phantom will go down in a snowstorm. And the distance between the man in that chair and the person he actually is will suddenly stop mattering. Because the one thing he never performed about will take everything else with it. The wreckage was located on March 24, 1987. 3 days after the crash. Dean Paul Martin Jr. Dino was 35 years old. He had been a musician first, then an actor, then a pilot, and then the mountain. Dean Martin was performing in Las Vegas when the call came in, and the world became permanently different. What followed is documented in the record not through what Dean said, but through what he stopped doing. Frank Sinatra, who had known Dean since before either of them was famous, who had watched the persona get built and worn and perfected across 30 years, organized the Together Again tour in 1988. The explicit purpose was to bring Dean back, to put him on a stage again, to give him a reason. They played a handful of dates. Publicly, Dean cited health issues. Kidney problems, he said, and that was not entirely untrue. But those closest to him said the health was not the whole story. He simply could not locate a reason to continue. The mechanism that had run for 50 years, the ease, the performance, the constructed indifference, had stopped, not gradually, all at once. At home, in the evenings, he watched old Western films. Alone, mostly. The television on, the room quiet, the same pictures moving across the screen that had moved across screens when Dino was still alive. There is something in that detail that resists easy interpretation. It was not grief performed for anyone. There was no audience. It was just a man in a house, watching the kinds of stories where things resolved the way things were supposed to resolve, in a world that had recently made clear to him that they didn't. His daughter Deanna would later describe that period with a precision that is more honest than most eulogies manage. He was still there, she said. But he wasn't. The body was present. The person who had animated it, the one who had walked into every room like the room had been waiting for him, was somewhere else. Or nowhere. she couldn't always tell which. What do you hold on to when the person who made everything feel worth it is gone? Sit with that question and tell us in the comments. He was 70 years old. He had 3 marriages behind him, 7 children, more money than he could spend, a career that had outlasted almost everyone he had started alongside. He had everything the Steubenville steel town had never offered and never promised. And he sat, almost every night for the next 8 years, at the same table at La Famiglia restaurant on Cannon Drive in Beverly Hills. Same chair, same order, more or less. The staff knew him. He was not performing for them. He did not need to. Tom Dreesen, who had known Dean for decades, documented the withdrawal in multiple interviews. He was there, but not there. Reachable, but not really reachable. Frank Sinatra said publicly that Dean had lost his will. It was not a criticism. It was a precise observation from a man who understood exactly what will had meant to someone like Dean Martin and what the world looked like once it was gone. He died on December 25, 1995. Christmas morning. Acute respiratory failure. Pulmonary emphysema. He was 78 years old. He had outlived his son by 8 years, and the record suggests that every one of those years was spent in the company of an absence that no performance could fill and no restaurant table could replace. There is a specific kind of person who builds their entire life around making other people comfortable, around performing ease so convincingly that the room relaxes, that the tension drops, that everyone present feels for a moment that things are lighter than they actually are. Dean Martin was that person at a scale most human beings never approach. 50 years of it. Every night, the glass, the grin, the unhurried walk to the desk. He gave 60 million people permission to believe the world was effortless. He was very good at it. It cost him something he never talked about. What this life reveals is not a lesson about fame, or about the price of performance, or about fathers and sons. It is simpler than that. The people who are best at appearing not to need anything are sometimes the people who need the most. And the distance between those two things, the performance and the reality, can hold for a very long time. Decades even. Until the one thing they never performed about arrives. And then there is no distance left. A corner table at a restaurant on Cannon Drive in Beverly Hills. The same table, almost every night for 8 years. Dean Martin sitting there. Not performing ease, not performing happiness, not performing anything. Just a man, eating dinner, waiting for something that was not coming back. If this story meant something to you, please leave a like. Not for the algorithm. As a small acknowledgement that this life deserved to be remembered carefully. Subscribe to Golden Era Stories, because these are the stories that don't fit in a headline, and they are the ones that matter most. What city are you watching from tonight? Leave it in the comments. We read every one. And if someone in your life is carrying something they never talk about, share this video with them. They'll know why. If you could say one thing directly to Dean Martin right now, what would it be?